Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting organized by the International Manifesto Group. I'll let Radhika speak to the IGM's work in just a moment. Again, thank you to all our speakers and the participants that are here on this early Sunday morning. We'd like to first begin this conversation with an acknowledgement that while Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which today's meeting is taking place, Zoom's headquarters are located on the Ohlone territory. The Ohlone are Native American people located in the northern California coast, tribes inhabited in the areas from the coast of San Francisco through Monterey Bay to lower Salinas Valley. The Ohlone are still there resisting ongoing colonization, settler colonization in particular. We would also like to acknowledge that our speakers and participants are located and connecting from across various territories across Turtle Island. I myself am speaking to you from the Dish with One Spoon territory in Toronto on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. I will be your moderator today, Chani, invited to facilitate this meeting by the IGM group. Just some housekeeping items. So the format of today will be that everybody will be on mute, and then Radhika and Suzanne, who've organized this meeting, will have some remarks to make, followed by a brief introduction by myself on just some context, followed by the amazing speakers that have agreed to speak today. The order will be Ali, Margaret, Peter, Beverly, and Nick. And then what we'll do is once the remarks are done, this will be opened up as a dialogue style conversation rather than traditional Zoominar where it's just the chat. And then I will take each question at a time and we'll sort of proceed with the conversation in that way. So without further ado, Radhika, if you could just tell us a little bit about the IMG and then followed by Suzanne with why you wanted to organize today's meeting.
Thank you so much, Chandni. I should also acknowledge that Winnipeg, where I am speaking from, is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. The International Manifesto Group, which has organized this meeting, is a group that began discussing the evolving political and what some of us call the geopolitical economy of the world order and its national and regional components at the beginning of the pandemic, when so many of us were wondering what was happening, what it meant. We don't just discuss the pandemic, as you see from this, we discuss a whole range of issues concerning world affairs. We have members from around the world, from the Americas, through Europe, Africa, and Asia. Of course, the Antipodeans get a bit left out because we meet in a time slot which is not very convenient for them, as do also people on the West Coast, but this was the best time we have for meeting. We meet fortnightly, and many of our meetings, in fact, most of our meetings are now becoming events because we want to discuss so many things and share it with a wider group of people. So this is what this Zoom event is about. So that's what the International Manifesto Group is. Thank you.
Suzanne?
Thank you very much. I'm Suzanne Weiss, and I've been active in the Palestinian support movement since 2005. And the initiation of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, BDS, since that time. And I've noticed in recent years, especially during the pandemic, I felt, but even before that, there was I was struck by the extent of the examples of the Palestinian resistance movement, the impact that it's had, in my opinion, on the Black Lives Matter and particularly and also the indigenous struggles and vice versa, I believe. So I thought this idea of having various leaders of these movements to get together and speak and discuss this issue, if this is in fact a fact, would be inspiring to us. When I go to pro-Palestinian demonstrations and rallies, I notice participants from a variety of social movements that take up common issues of oppression in the light of different experiences. This panel is intended to display how Palestinian solidarity helps to display these common features and strengthen our unity in struggle. And so therefore, I'm proud to be part of this discussion on that Palestine, I feel, is a unifier of the social movement and an inspiration to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. So moving into the context, particularly of this past year, in Jerusalem this past year, Jerusalem experienced its worst unrest in years as racist Israeli settlers, backed by Israeli police and the army, have been attacking Palestinians in cities across 48 Palestine, particularly in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, as Israel enacts its policies and practices of ethnic cleansing and illegal land annexation it has been enacting since the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 Naksa. In the weeks leading up to the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, Palestinians rose up to resist Israeli attacks in Jerusalem, particularly during the holy month of Ramadan. Israeli forces raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, gas worshippers attacked and arrested many Palestinians that were at the site. The Israeli military then escalated their violence, launching airstrikes into the besieged Gaza Strip, killing approximately 212 people. On May 18th, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and 48 took part, and as well as the diaspora, took part in a historic general strike on May 18th, 2021, launched a unity intifada that brought together the disparate geographies and populations in a unified resistance, and were also joined by the international community who have participated in solidarity demonstrations. In dozens of cities across the US, Canada, and elsewhere around the world, demonstrators have gathered to express their unequivocal solidarity with the Palestinian people. We saw thousands in the streets in the US, Canada, and the UK rising up for Palestine in unprecedented numbers. And some have said that we've seen numbers around solidarity with Palestine that we haven't seen before in the Western world. This Palestinian uprisings came on the heels of ongoing organized resistance against settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation that has been going on inside, as well as large-scale racial justice demonstrations that were seen the year before, specifically in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. That year and the years before, we also witnessed large-scale demonstrations in support of Indigenous liberation and their struggles against pipelines, climate change, and Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination across Turtle Island and elsewhere. Historically, internationalist solidarity with Palestine has a long and deep history, particularly among third world movements in relation to the Palestinian Revolution that forge insurgent geographies of connection and strategic alliances in opposition to imperialism, racism, and capitalist violence. We have seen the resurgence in international solidarity in the past 15 years, specifically around the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement that has regalvanized international support premised on principles and guidelines that target colonization, apartheid, and occupation. We are also witnessing joint struggle campaigns connecting structures of colonial and capitalist violence across these geographies. And so this morning's panel discussion will explore the historic and contemporary bonds of solidarity between anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggles of African Americans, Third World and Indigenous struggles as expressed in their common support for the cause of Palestine. Our first speaker will be Ali Abunimah, who is a director of the widely acclaimed publication, The Electronic Intifada, an independent nonprofit publication focusing on Palestine. He has written hundreds of articles and spoken on the topic all over the world. He is the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse, and the battle for justice in Palestine. Ali, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chani, and thank you to the organizers of this event, bringing us together from so many places around the world. And you can't see it, but I'm actually sitting in my car because I'm traveling this weekend. I decided to take a trip to Michigan to get out into the country. And I'm actually sitting outside the public library in Holland, Michigan, which is on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. And the view I've put up behind me is the view from Mount Pisgah in Holland State Park. And in the background, you can see Lake Makatawa. And it's a very, very beautiful area. If you ever have the chance to visit it, I highly recommend it. It's an area that was settled by Dutch settlers in the mid-1900s. And they're very proud of that. You can see everywhere memorials to the Dutch settlers and signs explaining the Dutch colonial history of this area. But what's completely missing is any mention. I've had to look and do my own research to find any mention of the indigenous people of this area, the Anishinaabe people, and particularly the Odawa people who inhabited this area before they were expelled and also attempted to be forcibly converted by the Dutch settlers. And that's a reminder that settler colonialism is everywhere around us. And it is not a historic event that happened in the past, but it is an ongoing process. It is an ongoing genocidal process, and one that needs to be constantly re-legitimized with the kinds of pioneer narratives that we see in this area on all the signposts I've been looking at this weekend, but also everywhere that what's called history is written. We're speaking now at a moment when I think about what's happening in Palestine, of both great hope and great excitement and motivation. And you'd think, how could that be following the horrific massacre that we witnessed in May in Gaza, which, as Chani mentioned, more than 200 Palestinians, 250 Palestinians were massacred. We've been watching in utter horror and despair the efforts to rescue, sadly unsuccessful efforts to rescue people from the collapsed condominium building in Surfside, Florida. The story of so many families, of so many people, have been saturating the media in this country, and understandably so, because of just the sheer unimaginable horror of losing family members in such a way. And yet such horrific, and that what happened in Surfside, Florida was, you could call it an act of God, an accident. Perhaps there is some liability involved in those who decided to maintain, who were responsible for maintaining that building. But such horrors were inflicted deliberately on people in Gaza. Just a few short weeks ago, the Al-Wahda Street massacre, in which dozens of people sleeping in their beds were deliberately bombed and killed, and their buildings collapsed onto them to kill them. Some families lost members spanning entire generations, with elderly people in their 80s killed along with the newest members of their family barely months old, which also reminds us that that this is a genocidal process. So we mourn these horrific murders inflicted by Israel. At the same time, we see Palestinians reveling in a renewed sense of unity and purpose in their resistance. Palestinians have always resisted. This is one of the important things I learned about indigenous. I knew that Palestinians always resisted because this is a struggle I'm close to personally. I was always told that indigenous people in North America and Turtle Island no longer existed, that there was no resistance anymore because the genocide wiped them out. It took me a while to learn that that resistance also never stopped and is ongoing and continues. So what the Palestinian resistance in May reaffirmed was the unity of the Palestinian struggle, and that it is very much alive. Remember that less than a year ago, with Donald Trump in the White House, Israel and various US client regimes supported by US imperialism and US weapons, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others, signed so-called peace agreements with Israel, which they thought they were celebrating. They thought they were celebrating their marriage to Israel over the dead body of the Palestinian cause. But less than a year later, they learned, perhaps to their dismay and chagrin, that Palestinians have not given up their struggle by any means. And for the first time in many decades, perhaps ever, we saw an uprising in every part of historic Palestine, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the 1948 conquered areas that are known as Israel, and of course in Gaza, where a small territory under siege for 14 years, isolated from the world, was able to resist and bring Israel's economy to a standstill for almost 2 weeks, to shut down flights to all of Israel's airports, and to impose on the besieger and the occupier at least a small measure of the siege and isolation that Israel has inflicted on Palestinians for so long. The other miscalculation that Israel made was, with the full complicity of or rather, let me say, with the impunity afforded to Israel by the so-called international community, Israel was encouraged to accelerate its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Jerusalem, particularly in the neighborhoods of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, in order to accelerate the transformation of Jerusalem from a city which has always been multi-ethnic, multi-religious, a city with a Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and Christian character, to try to turn it into an exclusively Jewish theme park. But a theme park whose creation involves incredible violence against the city's indigenous people. Israel thought they could get away with that with impunity. They did not imagine that Gaza would resist and intervene on behalf of Palestinians in Jerusalem. So the resistance is very much alive and has reaffirmed its presence and its legitimacy. So much for the situation in Palestine that we will certainly say more about. But what I want to also comment on is that we saw laid bare in May, once again, the global support structure for settler colonialism in Palestine? Who were the states and the governments that stood staunchly by Israel as it bombarded families and demolished their homes on top of them, as it demolished houses in order to steal the land under them from Palestinians in Jerusalem and across the West Bank? Of course, it won't surprise anyone here that it was the United States, that it was Canada, that it was the European Union and Australia. These are the strongest supporters of Israel. And of course, it is no coincidence that it is the settler colonial states and their founders, so to speak, the European states, that constantly proclaim their shared values with Israel, that are the biggest suppliers of weapons to Israel. This affinity is expressed in ideological terms, in terms of so-called shared values, something that former President Barack Obama always loved to talk about. He would repeat the myths of Israel's founding, along with the myths of America's founding, myths that reassert so-called manifest destiny and the naturalness and rightness of conquest and settler colonialism. But they're not only ideological, they're material. Of course, I've talked about the weaponry and the funding that the US and others supply to Israel. But Israel, you could say, also gives back to its sponsors. And we see this expressed in the particularly over the last 2 decades since the September 11 attacks, with Israel becoming the world's marketplace for so-called homeland security, with literally hundreds of delegations of police chiefs and police officers from the United States, from virtually every major city, including my home city, Chicago, going to Israel to learn Israel's supposed prowess in counterterrorism and countering violence, ideologies and techniques and technologies that are then applied in US cities against predominantly Black people who live under what has been described by many as a sort of military occupation, which again was laid bare over the last year with the renewed and constant and never-ending spasms of white supremacist police violence against Black people in the United States. So I'll just close these remarks by saying that what I'm in a process of constantly learning is the extent to which settler colonialism is an ongoing process, one that is present. We Palestinians talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 as the Nakba, the catastrophe. But we also insist that the Nakba is ongoing, the Nakba never ended, and that our task is to bring the Nakba to an end. But it has also been part of my education to learn that the Nakba, whatever it may be called in the different languages of indigenous people in North America, has also not ended. The Nakba of slavery has not ended because there has never been full restitution and reparation. So the settler colonial states remain a firm alliance with each other, perpetrating these ongoing Nakbas. And so our task is to work out how to connect our resistance, our intellectual resistance, our activist resistance, our advocacy, and also to understand that in Palestine, people are exercising their right to resist with the means that they have, and that includes also defending their right in Palestine to engage in armed resistance against colonial occupation and military attack by Israel, which is a joint attack, again, supported by so many states around the world. So I look forward to hearing the comments of the other panelists and participants, and to continue to learn how we can deepen and expand the solidarity and the solidarity that is without which we cannot liberate and decolonize our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Margaret is going to be our next speaker. Margaret Kimberly is a co-founder and editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She is the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents, and a contributor to the anthologies Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence, In Defense of Julian Assange, and Capitalism on a Ventilator, the Impact of COVID-19 on China and the US. Her work as an activist includes leadership roles in the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. Thanks for getting up so early and joining us, some of you very early. I want to thank the International Manifesto group for inviting me to participate in this webinar on such an important topic. Of course, we're focusing on Palestine, but I'm going to digress a little and begin my remarks by talking about Haiti. Just a brief overview of its history. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up. And I'll make connections between the two nations. Haiti was the home of Taino people before Christopher Columbus arrived there on one of his many invasions in 1492. Indigenous people were wiped out on that island that was first called La Española by the Spanish. Disease and forced labor killed them off there and throughout the Caribbean, in one of history's worst examples of mass murder. As always happened in this hemisphere, competition among European nations played a role in Haiti's history. The French succeeded in interloping upon the Spanish claim, and eventually Spain ceded the western third of the island to them. The eastern portion became the Dominican Republic. The French plantation system was particularly cruel, even by the standards of chattel slavery systems of that day. Enslaved Africans were quite literally worked to death as they produced sugar and tobacco. However, in 1804, they succeeded in defeating the French in a successful revolt. But Haiti was so valuable to France, they were forced to recoup their loss by selling their possessions on the North American mainland, what we know as the Louisiana Purchase. And in a great irony of history, the United States profited from the Haitian revolt of enslaved people by securing even more land to expand their own plantation system. But France was not done. In 1825 and again in 1838, they sent warships and threatened to re-enslave Haiti unless they were paid money, millions of francs. So great was the debt that it was not paid off until 1947 and was estimated to total what would now be $25 billion. When you hear that Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, you should know this heist is the reason for the continuing poverty. And I begin with Haiti because we see a connection with another liberation struggle. Haiti has never been allowed to be a sovereign nation, suffering from US occupation, the kidnapping of its president, a UN occupation which brought cholera and the deaths of 10,000 people, a puppet organization, the Organization of American States, forced Haiti to stop accepting financial help that Venezuela gave to that country. And those Petro-Carib funds were stolen by their corrupt oligarchs, who are the true government of that country. And so we must remember all of this when we're told that Haiti needs more foreign intervention. Every nation has a right to sovereignty, the right to control its own destiny. The Palestinian people have been denied that right as they were expelled from their homes in the Nakba, the catastrophe which formed the state of Israel. Israel is an apartheid ethno-state, which is fiercely protected by the United States and the NATO alliance. France went so far as to try to ban pro-Palestinian protests, but people ignored the edict and thousands of them gathered there as they did around the world. The people who stepped up to protest against Israel's latest mass killing spree in May of 2021 should know that they changed things. It's important to know that Israel lost so much legitimacy around the world that they were forced into a little window dressing, and longtime Prime Minister Netanyahu was replaced. But Palestinians still have their homes destroyed or are forced to destroy them themselves in order to avoid paying for demolition costs. Gaza is still a prison, and its people are forced to become spies in exchange for having permission to leave, even when they need medical care. The walls surrounding Palestine are higher than the Berlin Wall, and people wait under brutal conditions to go to Israel to work as cheap labor. Kids have long been in cages in Israel, and they're used as human shields by the IDF as they terrorize the population. There are so many rules of international law that are broken by the Israeli state. Exacting retribution against the civilian population is a direct violation of the Geneva Conventions, for example. I wrote in Black Agenda Report that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is the clearest example of a litmus test. There's no question that Israel practices apartheid, just as it was practiced in South Africa. You are either on the side of humanity and morality and legality, or on the side of Israel. There can be no fence straddling or equivocation when one witnesses the ongoing state-sponsored terror against Palestinian people. Black people in the United States are uniformly on the side of the Palestinian cause. That has always been the case. Malcolm X visited the Khan Yunis refugee camp in Gaza in 1964, and he posed this simple and obviously rhetorical question in his essay, Zionist Logic. Quote, did the Zionists have the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all Arab property for themselves, just based on the religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago? Unquote. The problem has never been with the vast majority of Black people and brave leaders like Malcolm X, but with what passes for leadership and the treatment meted out to those who dare to speak up. But this year was somewhat different, as Congressional Black Caucus members such as Cori Bush, Andre Carson, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley made statements condemning the attacks on Al-Aqsa and mobs attacking Palestinians and the theft of land. But unfortunately, we see people such as Representative Ilhan Omar in particular will often begin condemning Israel, but then fold under pressure, backtracking and denouncing her own comments. Black people in the US don't have sovereignty any more than Palestinians do. And a politician like Omar will start out with good intentions, but end up condemning the people she should be supporting by calling Hamas a terrorist group and Israel a democracy. What are the points of commonality between Haiti, Palestine, and other nations targeted by the US government and its allies? They are all under imperialist attack. It makes no sense to discuss the privations of various people around the world without getting to the heart of the matter. I'm a member of the Coordinating Committee of Black Alliance for Peace, and this is a portion of our May 17th statement linking Palestinian solidarity with Black liberation. Quote, as Black internationalists, we will always be in solidarity with the Palestinian people as they struggle against US imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. We understand that there will be no freedom for Palestine or for, or for any of the nations and peoples of the world still oppressed by the pan-European colonial capitalist project without the development of a powerful movement at the center of that project here in the United States, unquote. The Palestinian struggle, of course, has unique features, but it cannot be separated from other struggles. We see the US providing $3 billion per year to Israel. And unfortunately, the same politicians who may speak up or will still agree to fund the obscenely astronomical Defense Department budget that includes money for the countries they sometimes condemn. That is also how Palestine is linked to our struggle here. Defense spending in the United States, some $750 billion annually, is 60% of all discretionary spending. It is literally why we cannot have nice things. It becomes pointless to ask why our infrastructure fails or why we don't have government-funded healthcare or better schools. That is why the Black Alliance for Peace statement is so important. When we protest on behalf of Palestine or the right of Haitians to be rid of US puppets or against sanctions, which are war by other means, we are fighting against the colonial capitalist project. There's no reforming the way our Congress does business or hoping that politicians will suddenly see the light and vote against the National Defense Authorization Act, which gives money to Israel and to Venezuelan coup plotters as well. The Palestinians are just one group who need our support and our defense, but none of our efforts will be fruitful if we think that the system will accommodate itself to what we want in Palestine or Venezuela or Syria or anywhere else that the US and its allies choose to target for imperial control. Israel does receive the lion's share of US foreign aid, but so do so-called pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong and puppets who may still end up dead, or terrorists attempting to overthrow the Syrian government at the hands of head-chopping terrorists. It is a good thing that it is more difficult to hide Israel's crimes and the suffering of Palestinians. But emphasizing the demolished homes and the families killed is not enough. There has to be a greater understanding of why such obvious wrongdoing is supported by president after president and their foreign allies. We cannot merely see ourselves as well-intentioned people who want to end criminality. That's all well and good. But whether we realize it or not, we are also fighting for vast systemic change. It's funny to me, perhaps ironic is a better word, that Donald Trump was always described as a fascist, and yet Joe Biden, who defeated him, continues the same policies. The US Embassy is still in Jerusalem, for example. The JCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran and other nations languishes as the US tries to stick to the new rules, which also came into being because of Trump, who we are supposed to see as being uniquely evil among US presidents. We also cannot separate the international from the domestic. We can't have the nice things I referred to earlier or real democracy when there's an open revolving door from defense contractors straight to the Pentagon. The Biden administration dispensed with rules which would have prevented the current defense secretary from going straight from the Raytheon defense contractor to the Defense Department. The oligarchy takes less and less effort to hide how it does business. The United States and Canada began their existence with European invasions of indigenous lands, just like Columbus did in what became Haiti. Those crimes against humanity led to where we are today, with the descendants of the invaders supporting one another and their crimes committed around the world. The same Europeans who decimated native populations and enslaved Africans are also at the root of Palestine's struggle. Their actions in the region have led to coups, wars, and invasions. The colonial masters are still attempting to be the modern day masters too. The oppression of indigenous peoples in North America differs only from the subjugation of Palestinians in that it began centuries ago. But it would be a mistake to see Israel as being very different from its settler colonial precursors. Israel and the US are literal partners in crime, with American police training in Israel in order to bring their terrorism here to people in this country. And that is the connection we see around the world. The liberation movements cannot be separated, and we must definitely see ourselves as being in need of freedom too. it can truthfully be said that we are all Palestinians. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. So next we'll move to Peter. Peter Kolchansky is a professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. He is a scholar and activist who has worked with Indigenous social justice communities and groups, especially in Northern Canada, for 4 decades. He is the author of 9 books, most recent titled Report of an Inquiry into the Injustice, Belgrade, Shutangotain, and the Shatu Treaty. Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much. And let me say, I come from humble people, so it's really an honor for me to have a chance to speak, with such very strong voices as Ali and Margaret. I really appreciated much of what both of you had to say. And I want to emphasize that it's truly an honor to hear you and to be able to speak with you and move this discussion forward. I also want to say, and just let people know, when I give my own land acknowledgement, I always say these are lands, for example, in Winnipeg, stolen from Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Métis, Dakota, and Dene peoples. And I want to emphasize that we live on stolen lands here in Canada, as much of Israel is on stolen lands. And I think that's an important point to emphasize. I am absolutely in support, although, I'm not an internationalist. I haven't followed international struggles. I've dug deep and worked with Indigenous communities in the North and with Indigenous activist organizations in the South, fighting, against extractivism from a Marxist and a sort of theoretical perspective, but doing, the same organizing on the groundwork that many of you all undertake. But absolutely without qualification, I support the struggle of Palestinians for land and for sovereignty. And I believe that the Israeli state is a critical global focus for imperial capitalism in its current conjunction. And so imperial capitalism represented by the US, but by other countries, including Canada in part, is deeply invested in the Israeli state. And I'm absolutely, opposed to that in its current form. Similarly, I want to note that Islamophobia has reared its ugly head within Canada, and I think that's worth condemning. I also condemn anti-Semitism. I've been intellectually nourished from, by Jewish culture and thinkers, from Josephus to Walter Benjamin, and by some Islamic thinkers, Ibn Khaldun and Muqaddimah, all the way through to Edward Said, have also been influences on me. And for those of you who might be in this call who know anything about Islamic classical history tradition, please send me any readings and translation, as I love to learn more. That can only enrich me. It's Donna Haraway, a Marxist feminist thinker, who once said, we need to articulate alliances and not naturalize them. And I think that's an important point, and that's sort of, to a certain extent, the direction that I want to give my words. And this comes out of my own activist experience over some time. So, for example, in the 1980s, it was, Indigenous peoples and environmentalists in Canada were working together against a number of extractivist industries. And it was just kind of assumed that the environmentalists and Indigenous peoples are pretty much the same, they have the same agenda, until it was discovered that they don't have the same agenda. And the environmentalists hadn't really bothered to learn much about Indigenous communities, about Indigenous knowledge, about Indigenous culture, and that created a rupture. And I would say the movements, it's like they suddenly woke up and realized they had been sort of struggling around some of the same issues, but when it came to a broader level, there was a huge disjunction. A similar thing happened, I think, in around the period 2009 to 2014 in Canada, which overlapped with the creation of a national organization. I was a part of Defenders of the Land, that still exists, and the Idle No More movement, where to a certain extent, a large anti-racist community operating largely out of central Canada took on board the fact that Indigenous people were in a struggle and should be part of their politics. but anti-racism doesn't quite capture the dimensions of Indigenous people's struggle for Aboriginal rights. And so again, there was sort of like, oh, we're all in this together, but the anti-racists, for example, they wanted to drop Indigenous rights from one of the statements of solidarity of defenders of the land, and we had to push back with Indigenous leaders that I was working with. When I pointed that out to the Indigenous leaders, they like woke up, looked at the document and said, no, you know, we need to insist that treaty rights and Indigenous rights are absolutely a part of what we're fighting for and are in the basis of unity. And so, you know, there's been a history of Indigenous people being assumed to be part of a struggle and then basically being told to take a back seat to whichever larger group of people or, you know, more urgent environmental or global issue seems to be circulating. And so I found it necessary over many years to sort of push back against that a little bit. I do believe it's very important politically that Indigenous peoples forge a particular alliance with Palestinians. And so my comments are directed towards thinking about, on a practical level, how that can happen. And I'm going to borrow a little bit. I don't know if Suzanne was deliberate in talking about unity and struggle, but the great African thinker, Amilcar Cabral, had an essay on unity and struggle. And I want to refer to Cabral a little bit, who was always emphasizing, you know, two things that are dear to me. One is the particularity of struggles in order to form alliances, and the other is the Marxist concept of mode of production within a Marxist framework and analysis of particular struggles. So I want to think about that a little bit. So there are significant similarities, but also significant differences between Indigenous struggles and those of Palestinians, and we have to, you know, pay attention to those at least. And I guess one other thing I was going to say is I noticed in Northern Canada, starting in the late 90s, there seems to be a deliberate attempt on the part of Jewish supporters of the Israeli state in Canada, some of whom had some money, to try and bring Indigenous leaders over on tours of Israel to sort of forge a mutual understanding of the state of Israel and Indigenous peoples in Canada, and to try and sort of develop some inroads that way. So there are actually attempts on the other side, the imperialist side, to try and draw the legitimacy of Indigenous people's struggles into their own sense of legitimacy of the Palestinian settler colonial reality. And so that needs to be pushed back against. When I'm talking about, I'm not, you know, only on the level of theory. I'm saying that practical things need to happen because practical things are happening on the other side to develop a different kind of alliance that I think would be, you know, much less globally useful in the struggle for liberation. Let me think about, so from the materialist perspective that I'm coming from, I would say the notion of mode of production is critical. And here we have a difference between Palestinians in a pre-colonial era and Indigenous peoples in a pre-colonial era. And this for me is kind of foundational. So I frequently argue that the colonized subjects globally is a bifurcated subject. It's not a unified subject. Many, many colonized people come from former tributary societies, agricultural-based societies that had some degree of social hierarchy. Indigenous people come from bush cultures or gathering and hunting peoples, which also can be found globally. And I would say the word indigenous glosses over that distinction. And so bush cultures were far more egalitarian. Now, as I understand it from the little I know about Palestinian culture, both the influence of the Bedouins and the particular kinds of agricultural villages were far more communal historically. And I know there's a diversity among the Palestinian population as there is among the Indigenous population. But I would still say that the tributary cultural ground and the bush cultures have some significant differences, and that those differences influence the nature of the forms of settler colonialism that are imposed upon them, and also influence the nature of their resistances. And it's important to kind of come to grips and I think delineate those in order to then be able to say, you know, these are the real similarities, these are the things we can share, these are the things where we may have some differences. In both contexts, a settler colonial and capitalist for me is absolutely integral to thinking about this. Society has developed. The ideological justifications are significantly different, and that deserves at least a moment. So in Canada, it's the notion of terra nullius, that this was unoccupied lands. It's the justifications provided by John Locke. It's often said the United States is a Lockean society. It's the notion of primitivism, and the notion of the progressive benefits of modernism that underwrites settler colonialism historically, with different emphasis in different periods, but certainly in Canada. In Israel, settler colonialism is justified by the lengthy occupation or connection that Jewish people have to Israeli lands, and to the 20th century traumatic experience of the Shoah and the need to provide a structure never to repeat that. Those are structurally very different kinds of ideological justifications that demand different kinds of pushbacks and different kinds of responses. And that's all I want to say, but I want to say that those are the ideologies underlying and moving people and motivating people in these contexts, quite different, and need sort of different forms of pushback. What's interesting is that both settler colonialisms, the settler colonial state presents itself as a liberal democratic state to its own chosen citizens, to the settler colonial citizens, but acts as a totalitarian state to those it excludes and draws a boundary around. And this to me is sort of the most striking similarity. So for example, in Canada, the residential schools are a totalitarian institution. And of course, they've been in the news in Canada as we've discovered what many of us always knew was happening. The graves of many Indigenous children have horrified the Canadian population. But I myself attended a government-run residential school, and so I can say from direct experience, these were totalitarian institutions. And apartheid itself borrowed from Canada. South African legislators traveled to Canada in the 1930s, looked at the reservation system and the past laws, thought that was a good idea, brought those ideas back to South Africa and turned them into parts of the apartheid legislation that was so virulent and lasted for so long. And then some of that gets borrowed and taken to the Israel settler colonial. And so now you have walls and you have all sorts of similar totalitarian mechanisms being used. And I should say Margaret's comments reminded me a little bit about Hannah Arendt's statement that totalitarianism comes out of the colonial encounter and then gets brought back into first world contexts or so-called developed capitalist contexts whenever the state views itself under threat. Those same techniques of power that get used and that get elaborated and invented in places like Palestine will come back to haunt us as the supporters of that, as our own broader resistance to the nature of the capitalist state develops. In Indigenous contexts, or in the context of Bush people for the most part, but also, Mayans, Aztecs, Incans in the Americas were tributary societies as well and characterized themselves as Indigenous peoples. In all of those contexts, the struggle has been for the assertion of Aboriginal rights as a mechanism for protecting a land base as an enclave and cultural values as an enclave within a broader totality or within a broader nation. That's kind of been the mechanism that Indigenous peoples have used with greater or lesser degrees of success in a variety of international contexts. And I think that needs to be respected. And what's being pushed for by the most radical Indigenous leaders in Canada is that the Canadian state actually develop its policies based upon Aboriginal rights, first and foremost, rather than some notion of equality rights that would serve as a justification for erasing Indigenous culture, and rather than simply carrying ahead with extraction and the destruction of Indigenous lands. I have no idea, and I'm kind of curious about, does the declaration, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights, does that have any traction among the Palestinians or not? But it seems to me that the Palestinian struggle, as with the struggle in South Africa, had a significant difference in that Black South Africans were actually in the majority, so they could entirely overturn, well, but not necessarily economically as we've seen, but certainly politically overturn the settler colony. In Palestine, the land base is significant enough and the population is significant enough that a national struggle, for national autonomy, it really is the demand. And for that, I would think the Aboriginal rights demand would seem much more limited. And so I would say that there's a difference there. And I guess these are sort of opening remarks. I'm going to end with a quote by Amilcar Cabral, the great African thinker who was explicitly in favor of the Palestinian struggle, but in his own context, he had much to say about the bush. He used the term the bush, which is very dear to me in thinking about Indigenous struggles. And he thought of mode of production and culture as central elements, and he developed a materialist view of culture, which is what I've been talking about when I talk about tributary societies versus bush societies. And so Cabral says, we base our struggle on the concrete realities of our country. We appreciate the experiences and achievements of other peoples and we study them. But revolution or national liberation is like a dress which must fit to each individual's body naturally. There are certain general or universal laws, even scientific laws for any condition. But the liberation struggle has to be developed according to the specific conditions of each country, says Cabral. There can, and in my view, should be an alliance between Indigenous struggles for justice and Palestinian liberation. But such a reliance must be based on mutual understanding and respect rather than essentialist notions of a unified colonial subject. The colonial subject is bifurcated, at least along the lines of tributary and bush peoples, but also geographic conditions, population conditions, many, many other factors. Alliance politics must be actively built from the basis afforded by such an understanding. And certainly in my view, it doesn't help Indigenous people to be placed in second place anywhere. Although I also acknowledge that in terms of the broader geopolitics, which my colleague Radhika knows far more about than me, I know there are certain historical moments when certain struggles, like the Vietnamese struggle, like the Venezuelan struggle, and the Palestinian struggle, assume a great global significance and present an opportunity to have a direct confrontation with international imperial capitalism, which is a desirable thing to happen. So I'm going to say in some Indigenous languages, thank you to you all for your speaking and for your listening. So in Anishinaabe, we say Chimigwich, in Haudenosaunee, Nyawen, in Cree, Ekosani, in Inuktitut, Koyanami, Palak, and in Dene, Masi Cho. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Beverly Bain. Beverly is a Black, queer, feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist scholar and professor at the University of Toronto in the Women and Gender Studies and Historical Studies program department. Bain is the author of Fire, Passion, and Politics, the creation of Blackorama as Black queer diasporic space in the Toronto Pride festivities. In We Still Demand, defining resistance in sex and gender struggles, uncovering conceptual practices, bringing into lived consciousnness feminist activities on the Toronto Police Board audit.
That's enough. That's okay. I actually sent one note to just 2 lines. It's okay.
But more importantly, Beverly is a significant activist in the Toronto area and is one of the most respected feminist activists in the city and has been doing a lot of important work on no pride in policing. So Beverly, thank you for being here, and yeah.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you to the International Geopolitical Research Group, Radhika and Champney. Thank you for having me. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation with this esteemed panel, and for the conversations that have gone on so far. I am actually quite honored to be in conversation with you all. I'm going to start talking in terms of my experience in terms of struggle and how I came to struggle and my connection to the Palestinian struggle as a Black, radical, queer, feminist, and move through that from here. So I remember clearly when the struggle for Palestine was planted firmly in my mind. It was in 1982 with the massacre of mostly Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. I was at the end of my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto and had picked up a Newsweek, and on the cover was the story of the massacre. The story was told was one that demonized the Palestinian people and their claim to Palestine. They were labeled terrorists who were intent on the destruction of the state of Israel and deserved to be eliminated, was the narrative. That narrative bore a similarity to that which I heard so many times before. I grew up, I was a teenager in the 70s in the Caribbean, in Trinidad. And during my teens, between 1969 to 1973, there were uprisings in the Caribbean, which followed the neo-colonial, post-colonial era of Blacks and Indo-Caribbean and poor people in the Caribbean who recognized, and in this case, Black people in particular, recognized that things had not shifted, things had not changed in terms of the conditions for Black people post, the colonial period when the colonial rulers ruled directly. And now under independence, things were very much the same, if not worse. During that time, we were also hearing about the various kinds of international struggles that were taking place in the US, in South Africa, and around different parts of the globe, where Black people and Latin Americans and Indigenous people were in struggle. So during my teens in the 70s, with respect to the Black Panther movement, I learned very early on that the Black Panther movement was a terrorist group in the US, Black struggle in South Africa against apartheid, and the Black Power movement during that period. All of these struggles were seen as somehow facilitating terrorism among Black people who were actually supposed to now attain a status of respectability, a nation of respectability under post-colonialism, were now being influenced by Latin American communists and socialists, such as the writings of Che Guevara, the writings of Fidel Castro, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, and Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, and I think so all of these people were seen as really, were actually identified as terrorists. And as Black people, we were supposed to fear that kind of politics and that kind of solidarity. So it was in my teen years that I started realizing that those who were fighting to be free from some sort of tyranny and injustice were labeled terrorists, and that justified them being massacred and killed. So I already had that picture in my mind. When I arrived in the late 70s to Canada to attend the University of Toronto, I quickly became involved in Black radical politics, particularly in relation to police killings of Black people in Toronto, but also on an international level, as well with respect to Black and racialized and gendered struggles. I joined the Communist Party while I was a university student because I wanted to engage international anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist struggles. One of the things that I learned quickly when I came to Canada, and I actually connected with Black radical feminists in particular and Black radical activists in this country, was how significant and important the international struggle was. The international struggle with South Africa, the international struggle with Palestine, the international struggle, and the struggle with Indigenous people in this country. Often, as time moved through, we saw a sense of a silo happening. But I grew up and I started doing political work in the context of solidarity and international activism. I remember it was around 1985 or so, I came upon June Jordan's poetry on moving towards home. It was during this period I started reading feminist literature by Black and Chicana radical feminists in the US. This poem was later published in her collection on Living Room in the mid-90s. That poetry stuck with me. June Jordan had visited Palestinian refugee camps after the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in 1982. And she immediately made the connection between the Black racism and police violence in the US. Teresa Saliba, Palestinian feminist whom she traveled with in the 80s, stated, and I quote Saliba, that she affirmed our collective struggle, our resistance and resilience with a resounding, I think we can. And I think here that what Saliba was saying, and when she says that, you know, Jordan says, I think we can, I think she was saying that Jordan saying that we can form the solidarity, international solidarity around our struggles. Because Jordan was then speaking to what was happening in the US at this time in terms of the ongoing, you know, state violence and the US war on Black people and on Black activists in the US during, you know, the 70s, the 80s, and ongoing, as we see that it's still ongoing. The war has not ended, right? And she was saying that I think we can link our struggles because there are similarities while there are differences. There are similarities in our struggles. Jordan's subsequent travels to Lebanon allowed her to probe this question of solidarity more deeply. Her poem, Moving Towards Home, repeats a list-like elegy to the horrors she witnessed, Sabra and Shatila camps, beginning each line with, I do not wish to speak, but no, I do wish to speak about. She then does speak of bulldozers burying the dead, of whose arms and legs stick out of red dirt, of night-long screams of families forced to watch the murder of children and spouses, right? And when we think about that, I mean, she's saying we need to witness, right? We need to witness, we need to stand firm and witness what is happening. And that call to witness, right, is something that is, I think has been really stamped in my mind through my international work of witnessing here in terms of what's happening here in Canada around Indigenous struggles and Indigenous genocide, and to actually make the connection. And I think what often doesn't get talked about here in Canada is the reality that this nation, you know, that we call Canada, was actually founded and built upon, you know, genocide and slavery. And slavery falls out of the context of the conversation around the foundation of Canada as a nation, you know, and as, you know, Letabo tells us is that, you know, genocide and slavery do not have an edge. And when we think of genocide, we're also thinking not only of genocide here in Canada and genocide of Indigenous people, but then genocide of Palestinians in this context. And slavery do not have an edge, but the violence moves as one in terms of the way in which, you know, the level of continuous militarized, racist, settler colonial, capitalist, imperialist, you know, colonial violence move as one, and how it actually structures our ongoing everyday and our everyday lives in the context of militarization, incarceration, you know, the continued violence and impact and war on the bodies of Palestinian people, on the bodies of Indigenous people in this country, and on the bodies of Black people in this country and globally, and how we continue, you know, to see this happen. And yes, you know, I would say that we have witnessed these momentary moments of freedom And I think that is the thing that we have in common in our struggle, is that we do believe in a particular kind of freedom that is beyond, what was already imagined for us, right? That we believe that we can be free of this tyranny and reimagine and start imagining a different kind of world, right? That exceeds borders and nations. And I think we have to be really clear about that, because states and nations and nationalism and governments have continued, right, to devastate us. The Israeli state is an apartheid state, is a genocidal state. But so is the Canadian state, right? A genocidal state. A racist state, a white supremacist state. And so is that of the US, which in particular, and as we heard, from our first speaker, Margaret, the link to the destruction of the first independent Black republic in the world, which was Haiti, and the continued bombardment and destruction of that, and undermining of any possibility of that country ever, fomenting what is understood as as a concept of freedom for itself, right? So I also want to say that the struggle for around Black people and Palestinian people have always moved together. I've read where the Palestinian poet Ibrahim Nasrallah incorporated Black liberation politics into his writing. One of his poems was Africa Remains a Song, which he wrote for Steve Biko, a prominent South African anti-apartheid activist who was killed by state police in 1977, right? And then George Jackson, who was one of the Soledad brothers, who was in prison for killing a guard, and then he was killed when he attempted to escape, also had, the work of Sami al-Qasim, and people wondered how he ever got a hold of that. We have always found ways, as Black Palestinians, Indigenous people, to move beyond, to actually find ways to connect, to engage in solidarity. And I do think that what we need to be really focusing on, right, is that we must find a way to recreate and to sustain forms of internationalism. We can and we must, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Beverly. And our last speaker for today is Nick Estes. Nick is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe and a historian and award-winning journalist. He is the host of the Red Nation podcast. Estes is also the author of the really amazing book, Our History is the Future, which everybody should read, and The Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the long tradition of Indigenous resistance. Nick, over to you.
I just want to greet everyone in a formal greeting from Lakota people. You're all my relatives. I greet you all with an open heart and warm handshake. I want to begin by talking about Indigenous people in North America, but thinking about it in terms of international politics. Last week, the former Indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, said that the recent discovery of Native children's graves in Canada was, quote, part of the policy of extermination of the Indigenous movement. He further stated that policy has been extended to exterminate the proceso de cambio, the process of change in Bolivia, referring to the 2019 US and Canadian backed coup against his administration, which was democratically elected for a fourth term. Morales sees something that often goes unremarked in North America. If Indigenous people are talked about at all, it's often as victims. Certainly not as part of a global movement, or viable alternative to the current model of exterminationist settler colonialism. But in many instances, that's exactly how Indigenous nations are viewed. And as the previous speakers have pointed out, the process of extermination is an ongoing process, and settler colonialism doesn't just include Indigenous peoples, it also includes the subjugation of Black life on this continent. And what we as the Red Nation, an organization that I helped co-founded in 2014, have done is to see and try to position Indigenous peoples not just as mere local cultures that are only focused on a specific land base, but through our history of struggle, especially in the 20th century and the post-war moment, indigeneity had become fundamentally an internationalist phenomenon. And I've given talks before where I pointed out that the Indigenous rights framework that was introduced at the United Nations was only possible because of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa alongside the Palestinian struggle. And there's a hesitancy today to actually embrace the internationalist history, specifically because of the Zionist and racist backlash against having international solidarity. But nonetheless, it gets to how Indigenous peoples have seen themselves in relationship to colonizing states, such as the US and Canada. And it's important to introduce the question of imperialism to this conversation. And I think Margaret did a good job in explaining and how imperialism is integral in understanding not just Palestine, but also understanding Indigenous peoples and our movement for decolonization in North America. And specifically looking at countries like Canada, right? Going through this process of truth and reconciliation as if Indigenous exterminationist policies were only domestic policy or only policy directed at the so-called homeland. And the same could be said of the United States as well. We could think of organizations such as the Lima Group, which may have to change its name because of the historic victory of Pedro Castillo in Peru, who's charting a new path as the elected president of that country, away from the hegemony, the violent hegemony that Canada specifically has exerted over Latin America. And of course, this includes Canada's partner in crime, the United States, right? And, you know, looking specifically at this region is important, right? Because oftentimes, you know, Indigenous people in North America are highly romanticized. Oh, we're just local cultures. We're only concerned about the water that we live on, or this place that we have. We're primitive people. We don't have, you know, a world outlook, which is completely false. If you go back to looking at the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle and thinking about the way that Indigenous activists and water protectors were talking about their connections to Palestine, the keffiyeh was being worn at the front lines and was being attacked by CNN reporters, by so-called friendly white environmentalists, but also water protectors were talking about how the sanctions on Venezuela, which has the largest reserves of oil in the world, were a direct result of building and developing domestic oil production at the expense of Indigenous people in North Dakota. But the reason why these statements, even though they're fundamental to how we as Indigenous people, as part of the Indigenous movement, understand our relation to global geopolitics, doesn't fit the narrative, the nice narrative of Canadian environmentalism or US environmentalism. But I will say that neither of those movements will exist without Indigenous people. And I'll give you some concrete examples about why that's the case. And this isn't just a kind of cultural struggle or an ideological struggle, but is deeply ingrained in the concrete realities of Indigenous people and the experiences of genocide and settler colonialism. Because there's fundamentally a critical dialectic between foreign and domestic policy. You can't talk about Canadian residential schools without understanding that the extermination of Indigenous children wasn't because they just hate Indigenous people because of their language, their culture, their worldview, you know, all of those things that we're taught, right? But fundamentally, Indigenous people represented a political alternative to the Canadian state. And the same can be said of the United States and those movements, that these weren't just kind of programs based on hate, but there's actually an economic motive to access the land, destroy the children, destroy the family to access the land. That's always been the modus operandi of this country. So when we think about that in terms of the Indigenous people, you know, we also inhabit this kind of weird space in terms of that we were once considered an external foreign adversary, which was, you know, made us subject to all kinds of counterinsurgency campaigns, wars of extermination, that we slowly became kind of integrated as kind of domestic populations to be managed. And so if we think about the context of the United States and looking at the boarding school experience, and if we do numbers, maybe this isn't helpful, but Canada is literally the size, population-wise, is the size of the state of California, right? Indigenous people, you know, in Canada make up a more sizable population than they do in the United States, but there are 3 times more Indigenous people that we, you know, according to the census numbers in the United States than there are in Canada. There were 139 residential schools in Canada that have been identified. You know, of course, there's politicians that are saying there's upwards to 3,000, which may be the case. But in the United States, there's over 350 off-reservation, or excuse me, boarding schools in the US. And it's important to point out, I think, you know, Peter pointed this out earlier, that the reservation or the Bantustan system was taken from the reserve system in Canada, or at least inspired by it. It's also important to note that the residential school model was actually taken from the United States. The Canadian government went and sent its Indian agents and its missionaries to the US to visit the industrial, they called them industrial schools at the time, to understand that this is, you know, this is their model of extermination for children, right? So the kind of circulation of these ideas isn't unique to one specific location, but there's a circulation of ideas. And the other aspect that I think about in terms of numerical kind of, you know, populations, but also size, is thinking about how Indigenous people within Canada and the United States constitute a kind of a small percentage of the population, but play an outsized role as being the most confrontational arm of the environmental movement. And we could also say that about Palestine as being a small territory, but nonetheless occupying the kind of headspace of, you know, many liberation movements, and even the colonizers themselves. Why invest, you know, $3 billion a year into just direct military support? That doesn't even include the kinds of loans that are put into to Israel to fund its occupation and to fund the crushing of Palestinian resistance. To kind of put this into perspective, you know, Indigenous people in the United States and Canada are challenging around 25% of the potential carbon emissions to be put out in the atmosphere, just looking at specifically the carbon infrastructure. And this, you know, this is pipelines. That's equivalent to 444 coal-fired power plants. That's more than all coal-fired power plants left in this country, in the United States. It's also more than 324 million passenger vehicles. That's more vehicles that are on the road right now in both Canada and the United States. So looking at something like defeating the Keystone XL pipeline, which was posed to emit around 180 million metric tons of carbon emissions, is huge, right? Not only in terms of what it does for the environment, but the kind of impact it has on the industry, right? In both Canada and the United States. It's important to remember that Canada's primary goal in meeting, Justin Trudeau's primary goal in meeting with Biden, was to convince him to reverse his decision on the Keystone XL pipeline, right? It's also important to note that, you know, Canada has a material interest in the Western Hemisphere, as well as the rest of the world, because it's home to 60% of the mining corporations that go throughout the world. And so when we talk about, the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because when we talk about Canada or the United States, it isn't just this sort of rote, you know, blind kind of like extermination, that there's economic interests that are involved in all of these kinds of things. There's an economic interest in maintaining a sphere of influence with Israel in that specific reason, for all the reasons that Margaret pointed out earlier, to wage extermination and bloody civil wars, so-called civil wars in places like Syria, to destabilize that region. You can't talk about sanctions against Iran without actually talking about that Iran is one of the primary funders of Palestinian resistance, and is probably one of the reasons that's holding back Zionist settlers from completely taking over that specific reason. Not to detract from the heroic resistance of Palestinian people in Sheikh Jarrah, in Gaza, in the West Bank, but it's also to understand that there are material interests at play in this. You can't just divorce our understanding from these real geopolitical facts. There's a lot to say, and I'll post a link in the chat, because the Red Nation has already articulated our position and our platform on how we will deal with the Palestinian question, but also how the role of Palestine in native liberation movements. It's important to point out that Canadian politicians that are both, that are native, but also US politicians in the United States have overwhelmingly sided with the Zionist project. And we point out how this kind of opportunism plays into a larger kind of, what we call anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian opportunism in the United States, but also how Israel itself is courting Indigenous leaders and Indigenous movements, grassroots movements. Just this week, it was announced that the Black Mesa resistance had taken over $10,000 from an Israeli firm to develop water supplies. And it's important to remember that Palestinians have supported the Black Mesa resistance for decades. And this is a huge watershed moment, especially in the wake of these massive uprisings for a group of NGO leaders in the Black Mesa community to turn to Israel and to embrace the Zionist project in this particular moment. That's a huge crushing defeat for the Indigenous movement in North America, and it needs to be talked as such. When I was in Ramallah, one of the questions that was posed to me is like, why Palestine? Why is an Indigenous person, coming from some of the poorest people within the hemisphere, what do you have to offer Palestine? You can't give us material support. You can't, there's no, this isn't the 1970s. There isn't armed resistance in the United States. There isn't an active liberation movement that's kind of engulfed the world. What is it that Indigenous people in North America have to offer Palestine? And why choose Palestine? When you are at the bottom rung of your own society, you have no political power. And that's a fair question, right? I think it's a fair question. It may be insulting to some, but it's a fair question. It's something that we have to confront as organizers. And what I said, I thought about this quite a bit, but for me and for the Red Nation and the organization I'm a part of, we talked about this and we debated it. And it's because Palestine represents a political alternative for Indigenous nationhood, right? Because the current trajectory, the current horizon of liberation for Native people in Canada and the United States is a further embedding into the state structure, a further extension of recognition politics that actually don't fundamentally change the colonial relation. And we see this happening with Israel recognizing the sovereignty of Native nations, whether it's in the Southwest or whether it's in so-called Canada, as a viable political alternative. And so the alternative for us is further elimination, not only of ourselves by incorporating ourselves into the eliminatory framework of the settler state, but it's also furthering the elimination of Palestinian people in their own homelands. And so what we need a different alternative. I'm at time, but I do want to say, I do want to read a quick poem that I wrote after my experience in Palestine. And just the kind of because Palestine, it does evoke a lot of, I dare I say, romanticism in the struggle, because the culture of resistance is so strong and is so well known that it does have this effect, and there's been many Indigenous poets and artists who've looked to Palestine. It's close to our heart, even though it's so far away. So I'll just read this poem and I'll finish my my presentation. Colonial time creates different temporalities. It speeds up and slows down. It's thick like mud weighing on the feet of the colonized, attempting to stick them in place, in the past, or in forever negation. The feet of the colonizer, on the other hand, are light and mobile. The colonizer's time is quick. A US passport, the right color skin, the correct language, anything but Arabic, and an entitled jaunt grant fast access to a world others only dream about. A sidewalk, an access road, air, and ocean. Yet the colonial reality is meant to exaggerate time, to make its novelty on the historical stage seem as natural as the olive groves and rolling hills. Like the ocean or Gaza, the history of known freedom is just over that hill. Though it stretches far back into time, it is familiar to everyone. A poem, a song, a story, a stone, you can smell it. It's the fire that still burns in our hearts, thousands of grasslands and sacred mountains away, where we also put our feet in the dirt, grasped our history and said no, and we came crashing down on them like waves of history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And just a huge thank you to all the speakers today for your really important contributions, your analysis, and indeed your poetry as well. I just want to, before opening up to questions, you know, just take us back to some of the key points or some of the key reminders that our speakers have offered us. They've reminded us of the ongoing Nakba and the intimacies between various settler colonial states that have produced various Nakbas, the Nakba of slavery, the Nakba of settler colonialism in Turtle Island, and the Nakba of Palestine. They've reminded us of centering imperialism in our analytics to not only understanding Palestine, but also Indigenous struggles in North America, Haiti, and elsewhere, and the economic interests of these settler colonial states in plundering and committing genocide. They also remind us of the challenges of solidarity and the internal contradictions within our movements, and also the importance of understanding distinctions across contexts when unifying struggles. They have called us to witness genocide and slavery from Canada to the US, and also linking that to the genocide of the Palestinian people. They've called us to sustain forms of internationalism, and they've also called us to deepen and expand our solidarity for collective liberation and decolonization. Most importantly, this call has been emphasized for the need for different alternative futures. So I thank you all for these reminders, contributions, and I mean, that summary doesn't encapsulate an hour and a half of insight, but I now would like to open it up for discussion and a dialogue between some of the participants that are here. So thank you so much again to all the speakers. And yeah, I suppose perhaps using either the raise hand function or just, you know, so I can create a speakers list to who will go first. Okay, so I see John Ross. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, I think that what Nick said is very, very, very important. The genocide against the indigenous peoples of the Americas is the largest in the entire history of the world. I don't mean by that to in any way to minimize the horrific genocides carried out against the Jewish people by the Nazis, or the Caribbean Atlantic slave trade. But the genocide against the Jewish people is about around 6 million. And the Atlantic slave trade is 10 to 15 million, depending on how you take the estimates. But the genocide against the indigenous people of the Americas is between 50 and 100 million people. And this is absolutely vital for the population of the world to understand, because that undermines, if you take the origins of the United States, the origins of the United States is encompassed in the genocide against the Native American population and slavery. That's the real origins of the United States. And what we have in the question of the Palestine, I would have a slightly different view. We can discuss this because I think it's not genocide in the direct sense. I would call it ethnic cleansing rather than genocide, in that is the attempt. It's to attempt to completely eliminate the people of Palestine from their own homeland. I don't think it's quite the same as the slavery or genocide which was carried out in America, but nevertheless, this is what are you talking about? You're talking about the distinction between monstrous crimes against humanity. And what I think it's very, very important to understand, and would be a great step forward, because in the West, we think the worst example of genocide that's popularly presented is against the Jewish people under the Third Reich. And this is indeed horrific. Not only, to use the word horrific, just understate the situation ridiculously. This is such a gigantic crime against humanity that it has to be emphasized all the time. The one after that is generally recognized is the Atlantic slave trade, which is in scale even bigger than the genocide against the Jewish people on the Third World. But the biggest genocide in the entire history of the world is that which is carried out against the indigenous people of the Americas. And I think it is very important, as Nick said, that this is generally understood, by progressive forces within the world. Okay, thank you very much. End.
Can I say something? Yeah.
So Margaret and then Beverly, and then Margaret, Beverly, and then any of the speakers that would like to respond to John. Go ahead, Margaret, Beverly, and then whoever else would like to respond.
Thank you so much. I think we have to be careful. I know John was being careful with his explanation because it can sometimes seem like some kind of a competition regarding numbers or something. But I think it's important to understand that genocide has been defined. There's the United Nations, for example, has some year after World War II defined genocide. So people say, for example, the children who died at these indigenous boarding schools, this is almost like a genocide. Well, no, taking children away from a group is a criteria of genocide, harming a population in any number of ways. So we see, unfortunately, this word attached to certain groups. So if it's not mass murder, it's not a genocide. Or people died from disease, as many indigenous people did. That's not a genocide. It is. All these things happened as a result of invasion, and that is where and how the word applies. So we're talking about Palestine. So taking people's land is genocide. Harming a population is genocide. All of these things, all of these criteria apply. So the result is, the logical extension of this discussion is there's been a lot of genocide throughout history, but there's a thread of conquest, a thread of invasion. And all of these things hold true throughout these different circumstances in different parts of the world. But I think it's very important to see the connections from this hemisphere to what people are going through now in Sheikh Jarrah. If your land is being stolen from you because of the group you belong to, that's genocide. Thank you.
I just want to say I get very disturbed by these kinds of conversations about trying to define, what these concepts are. The reality of the matter is that we are produced for, some of us are produced for death. Let's just be clear. And that's an ongoing process, right? Black people, indigenous people, the Palestinians are actually, it's an ongoing reproduction of people that is intended for them not to survive, for them to die. I think these are the kinds of questions we should be speaking about. The long struggle of indigenous Palestinian and Black people that have gone on for decades and decades and decades for freedom, for air to breathe, right? Where we continually get reproduced in various ways for death, constantly by new kinds of militarization internationally, politically, socially, economically, that continues to kill us in many different ways, to destroy us, to make it impossible for us to live, to survive. I mean, the fact that when we look at what's happening with Palestinian children, the maiming and destruction of Palestinian bodies, which doesn't necessarily always end up in Palestinian people being killed, but is a destruction, an attempt by the Israeli state to destroy Palestinians' possibilities. We see that here in Canada around Indigenous people, right? The occupation of land, the destruction of the extraction of minerals, of wealth that belongs to Indigenous people, the extraction of the control of the environment, the manipulation is a way to ensure that Indigenous livability, right, is undermined, is terminated. So I think we have to start thinking more in terms of how we actually build struggle, build international struggle, build international cross-international struggle among Indigenous, Black, Palestinian, and other people who are in struggle for a kind of freedom that goes beyond. And I just want to say that we've seen these momentary moments of freedom. We saw what happened, and we saw these exchanges. We saw what happened in the US last year with the reckoning after George Floyd. We also saw simultaneously in Palestine, Palestinians, painting a big mural of George Floyd and supporting Black struggle simultaneously. We have seen that happen also in terms of Blacks supporting Palestinian struggle at particular time. But there is an undermining of our struggle that takes place at different moments. And we see this happening. So now we saw, a sort of a surge in movements, of Black movements, of Indigenous movements, of Palestinian movements here in Canada in a way we have not seen historically, right? But is that enough? Can we assume that that means that things are shifting? Or is that another glimpse of our momentary freedom? How do we sustain these kinds of struggles? How do we sustain this battle? Because we are in a war for our lives, for our livability, for our futurity. Palestinian people are in a fight for their livability and futurity, and they have a vision of what the future should be, right? Indigenous people have visions of what the future should be. Black people have visions of what the future would be. How do we then build and sustain that kind of international struggle? That's what I think we should be preoccupied with. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. Nick, before you comment, I just wanted to let Ali make a comment because he has to run off. So I just thought if Ali can chime in and make a comment before he heads out, and then we'll return to you and then Peter. Ali?
Yes, thank you. I have to go at 11, so I'm going to stay till the last minute that I can, because this has just been really an incredible discussion. And what's particularly valuable for me is hearing all of these things that I think about a lot tied together from different perspectives, that people see the situation in Palestine. It's immensely valuable for me to hear Margaret Kimberley, talking about Palestine from her perspective, from a Black radical perspective, and Beverly Bain as well. And I so deeply admire the work of Red Nation and Nick Estes, and to hear his answer to that question, why Palestine, was so valuable to me and inspiring, because we often, as Palestinians, we often think that, or we're told to think that our cause is hopeless, and we know it isn't hopeless. The one thing Palestinians stubbornly refuse to surrender is hope that they will see liberation in this lifetime. But for Nick to talk about Palestine as a source of inspiration to Indigenous people who are struggling for their existence is actually a gift to Palestinians, because it makes us feel that our struggle is seen and heard and appreciated, and to be a model is really to be told that you offer something that goes far beyond your own particular place and context. So I'm very grateful for those perspectives. I think what I want to say is that, for me, now I'm a second generation of the Nakba, let's say. My parents, who are in their 80s, experienced the Nakba firsthand. And I'm now almost 50, and I was born outside Palestine, lived all my life outside Palestine, but the cause of Palestine lives within us wherever we are. But what I want to say is that I think because we have lived with the Nakba for so long, because Indigenous people in North America have lived with the Nakba for so long, it is difficult to imagine an end to it. We think that the situation that we've been in for so many decades is the situation we'll always be in. And I think that what I've always felt, but what the uprising in Palestine in May sparked once again, or gave me a greater sense of, is that liberation is within our grasp. And our parents, our grandparents who are still alive, who witnessed the Nakba, should see liberation in their lifetimes. This morning, when I was on my way here, I heard an interview with Joanne Henry, a Tlingit woman who was kidnapped from her family and forced to go to the Lower Post residential school in British Columbia 64 years ago, where she was tortured and abused like so many other children. And she's now an elder. And she talked about how at the age of 6, her long hair that came down to her waist was cut off. And for the rest of her life, she could never regrow her hair until now, seeing that school demolished with mixed feelings. Of course, maybe that demolition, whatever it represents, perhaps it represents some form of recognition or justice, but Joanne Henry should also see liberation in her lifetime. In other words, the thing I always tell myself, and I hope to tell others, is that we have to constantly remind ourselves and each other that liberation, whatever it may mean for us, whatever our vision is not something that is always postponed to the distant, far future, but something that we should be seeking within, it's always hard to put a time frame, but 5 years, 10 years, not 20 years, not 50 years, not 100 years, because we've lived with this for too long. And that's the hope I think we have that we have to carry, that kind of transformation is within our grasp. And there are reasons for hope. There are reasons for hope that that's possible, that we don't have all the capacity to go, we don't have all the time to go into every aspect of that. I hope this conversation is just a start of that. But that's what I take from this, and that's also what I hope to give people from it. I will spend the last minutes that I can listening, and then I will quietly duck out. But I really appreciate the Manifesto group and everyone for sharing their perspectives this morning. It's been incredibly valuable and moving for me to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Nick?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ali. The respect and admiration goes both ways. I really like EI and what you all do there. Very influential on the work that we do at Red Nation as well. I want to just respond to the original question, because I think it raises important points, especially around the question of genocide. And to use an example, the residential schools, or the boarding school system as we know it today, was very much pioneered by a man named Henry Pratt, or Colonel Pratt. He was a former Civil War veteran who had commanded mixed units in both the Civil War, then later, of course, in the Indian Wars. And those mixed units encompassed freed, Black people, as well as Indian scouts, as well as white people. And they were all unified in these frontier armies towards exterminating the Western tribes, or waging wars of extermination against the Western tribes. And he looked and saw, like, it troubled him, this, using his kind of logic, that there was a path, or there had been a path towards citizenship for Black soldiers, but there was no path for citizenship or incorporation into the settler state for the Indian scouts, because they would just return to their homelands or the reservations and continue to, to live as Indigenous people, and to be, problems for the state. And he says, so why is it that Black people can be assimilated into, quote unquote, American, or what he called Americanized, and Native people can't? Why aren't they given that opportunity? And these views that he had were very, quote unquote, progressive for his time period. But what he saw is that he's like, well, we took Africans, we stole them from their country, we stole them from their languages, their cultures, their homelands, and their families. And we, essentially, according to his thinking, we erased them so that they could become malleable American subjects. We have to reproduce those conditions of natal alienation, removing, children from their families and placing them within the kind of confines of another group, which is, as Margaret pointed out, the definition of genocide. And that's where he got the idea for boarding schools. That's actually where it comes specifically from African genocide, from Black genocide and slavery. And so it's important to point this out. It's not that these kind of systems are operating independently of each other, but they're actually informing how, modes of domination and subjugation. And I just wanted to point that out, because it's something that doesn't get really spoken about in the residential school experience or the boarding school experience, that it has its historical origins within specifically genocide against Black people. And to kind of get to what Beverly pointed out as well, I think it is important to foreground these kind of freedom dreams, to use Robin Kelly's framework, and to foreground these visions of decolonization, that the reason why there were, not just mass protests, but mass police riots against uprisings in major cities against, Black-led movements, is because these movements represented alternative community control, alternative political orders, And that's the reason why they have to constantly be crushed. And we don't organize, we're not natural allies based on common historical experiences, because that has historically proven not to be the case. Just because, you know, certain people are subjugated doesn't make them immediately, you know, politically or culturally, you know, aligned on certain issues. But that has to happen through struggle. That has to happen through actually having an alternative vision, and not just, you know, having your harms and injuries recognized, and then have the perpetrator of those harms and injuries come in and be the mediator of justice, right? And that's what we see with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Canada, is that the perpetrator of genocide then goes in and says, hey, now we're going to be the arbiters of justice. What kind of framework is that? It's like it's the most toxic, you know, unrealistic framework you know, that you can imagine. And so that can't be the future, right? And I think what, you know, Palestine represents in this moment is that is not the aspiration, right? It's not just a kind of localized, you know, net zero result for Palestinians, right? But it's understanding that these things are connected, and that there is a shared vision of what freedom looks like, and not something that's just about suffering or ending suffering, but it's actually kind of inaugurating an alternative political order. But I don't want to go too much into that, but that's all I just wanted to say in response to that particular question.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, so I guess two things. One, just picking up from where Nick just left off, and I appreciated all the responses to the question and the question itself. I do believe in the pores of bush culture, we can find some inspiration in terms of thinking about what liberatory societies might look like on the one hand. And I also just want to emphasize that in, you know, the over-incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples, in the child and family services system that operates to steal children today from Indigenous families, in the murdered and missing Aboriginal and Indigenous women and girls, in the boil water advisories on so many rural reserves and so many other things, we do have a continuing genocidal system operating in Canada that's absolutely, you know, running rampant and continuing. So I'll just let it sit there.
So we are at 11, and so I know some people need to run off, and so whoever needs to go, of course, thank you for being here, but we also understand if you need to head out. I know Beverly's heading out, Ali's heading out. We'll take two last hands. Michael.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for the conversation. Bye-bye all.
Bye, Beverly. Bye, Beverly. See you.
Thanks, Shanley and Radhika. Bye-bye.
So Michael okay, so Brendan's hand went down. Michael had a question, so perhaps we'll take that question and then wrap it up after that. So Michael Wongsum.
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's an observation on the discussion. I think that when people talk about genocide, as horrific as it is, they're not actually talking about they're talking about the consequence of what is underlying it. And the thing that's underlying it, which we have to turn our attention to, and which I think is what is revealed by the Palestinian struggle, is the question of settler colonialism. Because you see, settler colonialism is something which underpins a lot of these struggles around the world against modern day imperialism, but goes back to the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula, which led to the financing of Christopher Columbus's voyages, and therefore determined the subsequent history of the Americas. And I think that if you consider, okay, so, you know, that was settler colonialism in the Americas. We also have the same thing, exactly the same thing in Australia and New Zealand, exactly the same thing in South Africa. And what we have in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, is the modern day equivalent. It's a modern day colonial settlerism. I think that Ali referred to this in his initial introduction. And it's the modern day settler colonialism, which leads to the genocidal consequences of the need to, what happened in America? They pacified the indigenes of the continent, both in South America by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and in North America by the English and the French. They pacified the Aborigines in Australia, and they pacified the Bantu and the Zulu in South Africa. That is genocide is a consequence of that process of pacifying the Indigenes of these places, and leads to, you know, all of the various manifestations that puts forward. So, you know, what people have talked about, the erasure of culture, and which you know, one of the things that led to that was the boarding schools in North America that Nick has talked about. It's also the case that they had boarding schools in Australia and New Zealand, and the Bantu stands that we saw in South Africa are what have been being recreated virtually in exactly the same form in Palestine, in what Ali called the ongoing Nakba. So that is what we need to, and the reason that I think that this is a fantastic title for this particular session. It's called the Unifying Struggle. It is unifying because it's a modern day equivalent of settler colonialism, which is unfolding right before our eyes. So I just think that we need to bear that in mind.
Thank you. And Brendan, and then perhaps closing thoughts from Radhika.
Hi, just thanks to all the panelists for a really great session. These are just a couple of somewhat broad questions. I'd love for the panelists to take them in whatever direction they want. I'm just kind of curious about the changing geopolitics of the region, and how the panelists think that the relative decline of Western imperialism and the rise of other regional powers affects the prospect for Palestinian struggle. Basically, does the emerging multipolar order and the rise of regional powers like Iran and especially China offer any openings to Palestinian struggles? And then the second part of that question, I'd love to any thoughts on the role of China in particular. China has a long history of supporting Palestine. It has a relationship with Israel, has limited in limiting the US's military foothold in the Middle East, and even this year put out a peace plan and offered to hold peace talks. So I'm curious if any panelists or anyone has any thoughts on the sort of evolution of China's position in this struggle. Thank you.
I can answer very, very quickly. The multipolar world helps the Palestinian people. It helps all of humanity. After the fall of the Soviet Union and this balance of power relative balance of power between Israel and the Arab states, which were supported by the Soviet Union, the Palestinian people's condition worsened. So the multipolar world, China's involvement, Russia's involvement can all be beneficial, only beneficial. Thanks.
Anyone else? Nick or Peter, do you want to respond, or can we? Okay. Then I'll turn it over to Radhika for her question or her last comments to wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks, Chandni, and thanks to all the speakers. It was really very inspiring. And what Michael was saying at the very end, Michael Wong-Sam, really made me think about this, because it sort of brought out from the back of my mind something I'd been mulling over for a long time, because I think it's absolutely right that we should, of course, acknowledge the scale and the extent of the genocide that has taken place. I mean, I'm not at all questioning that. But I think we also must link what has happened to the question of labor. Essentially, settler colonialism involves a couple of different things. On the one hand, you need to take away land from people, so you need to destroy them as people. In many ways, that's why the attack on the genocide, that's why the attack on cultures, languages, and the nationality and sovereignty of the peoples that are encountered. But at the same time, then they need to be denatured, decultured in order to serve as labor. And of course, then this also allows us to link in with the African-American question, or the slavery question, precisely because settler colonialism arrives and requires a lot of labor, which it does not have, then it imports further labor. So labor is critical. So I think land, of course, is critical. I've expressed my solidarity is with the people who are struggling for land, but there is also this labor question, because essentially what the reserve system has done in South Africa, of course, it was basically the reserve was a kind of labor reserve pool from which you could extract labor as necessary and push it back when it was not necessary, etc. In Canada as well, the reserves, being economically unviable as they are, naturally or inevitably push out people who then come to the urban areas where where Indigenous people do not even enjoy the few meager benefits of being a status Indian, as they are called in Canada still. But they suffer all the discrimination, all the marginalization, all the deprivation, and worse, of any peoples in the country. So, but at the same time, they're also a labor reserve pool. So in that sense, I think the question of labor is directly involved, because ultimately, even in the case of the genocide of Jewish people, the original idea was to make them work. Arbeit macht frei, it said on the entrance to Auschwitz concentration camp. It was to make them work, and make them work so hard it didn't matter if they lived or died. And of course, similar treatment was meted out to African Americans when they were enslaved in the United States. So I think this question should also be connected, because this also then allows us to bring it back, to make these struggles also better theorized in terms of ideas, existing ideas about socialism, national liberation, etc., etc. I just wanted to throw that in. Thanks very much.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this very robust conversation and presentations. And again, thank you all for being here. A recording of this will be posted also on the website
on the International Manifesto group.
On the International Manifesto group, and there are also other forms and ways that this podcast might get republished. So this conversation might get republished. So thank you again for all being here. I hope you have a good Sunday afternoon, and check out the manifesto of the IMG group.